What's up, ghosts? Today, I will be sharing with you the story of one of the most haunted locations in the world. But I must warn you, the history of Sloss Furnace is long and terrible. This is one of the most graphic episodes I've done, so it will not be for everyone. Let's get into it. You might be familiar with Birmingham, Alabama, being the location where Martin Luther King Jr. penned a famous letter from a local jail, outlining the moral responsibility of the people to break unjust laws. But what you may not know about the city is the abundance of rich minerals that underlay its very foundations, and the near apocalyptic conditions poor Southerners were made to endure for nearly a century by wealthy businessmen who would exploit the area. Seams of iron ore stretched through the Red Mountains. Deposits of coal abundantly made up much of the area to the north, while other important minerals like dolomite and limestone lay in abundance underneath much of the valley itself. All of the ingredients to make iron, and all within mere miles of each other, made this area rich beyond measure. And this was recognized in the years following the Civil War by budding entrepreneurs who didn't hesitate to take advantage of it. In 1871, Birmingham was founded, and because of those resource deposits, it was quickly nicknamed the Magic City. But by some cosmic decree of fate, it seems that anything good carries with it a dark side. And the horrors that took place in the following years in Birmingham illustrate that very fact. During the early years, companies built industrial furnaces all over the valley, capitalizing on the area with the intention to mine and produce iron and steel. And in 1873, a man named Sloss Jowers found employment at various furnaces working as a foundryman. In order to ensure that his wife Sarah, along with their 5 children, were comfortable and felt secure, he promised Sarah that, quote, "As long as there's a furnace standing in this county, I'll be there." That promise may have sealed his fate for all eternity. While many like Jowers toiled as lowly workers, others, those smart enough to take advantage of the business opportunities, the entrepreneurs, they made their move. In 1880, a man named Colonel James Withers Sloss had an active hand in bringing about one of the most influential business ventures to the Magic City that the South had ever seen. Sloss founded the Sloss Furnace Company, which took advantage of the abundant resources, but what gave his business an edge over the others was his prior experience with the railroad industry. And it was ultimately his savvy business intellect that convinced L&N Railroad to come to Birmingham. This decision ultimately transformed the city, at the time full of shanties lining mud roads, into a booming industry town. The railroad helped Sloss expedite the sale of pig iron and transport much-needed materials to the rest of the country. Sloss Furnace also took advantage of the abundant new workforce, i.e., freed slaves. In November of 1881, the local press, so impressed with Sloss, advocated he be governor of Birmingham, showering him with praise, stating, "His excellent business qualifications, brilliant intellect, splendid character, and fine executive ability, all combined, make him the grandest man in Alabama today for our chief executive. He is the very personification of Christian manhood and integrity, possessing the qualifications of head and heart, which we should all emulate." Although Sloss was a smart man, given a critical look at the conditions people were made to work in his own company, which mirrored the horrid standard prevailing in the nascent age of the American Industrial Revolution, along with a general lack of concern for the well-being of employees, It could hardly be said that Sloss embodied the personification of Christian manhood and integrity. What happened to two black workers, Alec King and Bob May, in November of 1882 in his furnace illustrate this fact. The two were given the task of cleaning coke, that is, deposits of processed coal from the inside walls of one of the large blast furnaces. But turning off the furnace in order to accomplish this goal would only slow production, so horrifyingly, while the fire raged below, King and May were lowered into the top of the stack on a platform, held up by ropes. It wasn't long, as you can imagine, that one of the many things that could have gone wrong in this situation did. As the two chiseled away at the rock-hard coal deposits, the heat and gases from the furnace below started to overwhelm them. Becoming delirious, King started to stumble around on the shifting platform. May, reaching out to stabilize his fellow worker, lost his footing as the platform jolted back and forth, reportedly from a nearby explosion, and the two of them tumbled helplessly into the furnace below, incinerating both of them nearly immediately. Jowers, now working at Alice Furnace across the way, along with another man, Samuel Cunningham, who worked in Sloss's furnace, both heard of the incident, and both, shocked, had little choice but to continue working in their respective furnaces. The operation continued day in and day out, hardly ever stopping. And just a week later, perhaps in some depressing way, inspired by what happened to King and May, and tormented with the horrors he faced in a work environment that regularly reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit, Cunningham climbed to the top of one of the furnaces and, overwhelmed with it all, threw himself in. Like King and May, he was incinerated. Again, workers were shocked, but Jowers doggedly pressed on, the steadfast desire to provide for his family motivating every step he took within essentially what most felt was like working in hell. On the backs of cheap labor and with state-of-the-art blasting furnaces, in the first year, the company manufactured and sold 24,000 tons of iron. And in 1883, Sloss Furnace won a bronze medal for best pig iron produced. The Magic City was starting to boom, and Sloss had his hand in the wealth that Birmingham was mounting, despite the several terrible deaths already reported. Over the next decade, the company would grow rapidly, building upwards of 19 new blast furnaces as Alabama's gross pig iron production increased from nearly 69,000 to over 706,000 gross tons. Though work was hellish and horror stories already pervaded the ether, the job was paradoxically also highly sought after, being a quite advanced industry at the time, and there was no shortage of men willing to work. In fact, Sloss's booming operation instilled in the South a newly restored confidence and pride not felt since prior to the Civil War. And at some point around this time, Joseph F. Webb, a man with no desire, understandably, to work in the furnaces, would find his passion in the arts, and he began painting murals of the trains that would roll in and out of bustling Birmingham. He was happily married and lived a modest yet fulfilling life. Only a few years later, Sloss retired from the company in 1886, a wealthy man, and many credit his business prowess and overall genius to not only influencing the direction of Birmingham, but also changing the course of history, as it was Sloss Furnace that manufactured much of the material used to carve out the epic New York skyline. It was Sloss Furnace that helped bolster the automobile industrial boom in Detroit. And it was Sloss Furnace that provided much of the required materials to build ships and planes used to win both world wars. But all of this was done at an incredible human price. And looking back on the history of the place, one wonders if it had to be the way it was. With Sloss gone, however, the horror of the furnace, incredibly, was just getting started. Just a year after Sloss retired in 1887, Jowers, doggedly holding on to his promise to make sure his family was supported. Through blood, sweat, and tears, he managed to work his way up the chain, and he was promoted to assistant foundryman at the Sloss Furnace, across the way from Sloss Furnace. And on September 9th of that same year, he was supervising the repair of one of the large melting bells when he slipped off of the catwalk. Instinctively, he reached out and attempted to grab the bell, suspended in midair, but the bell broke free as he desperately clung to it. And it, along with Jowers, tumbled into a vat of molten iron. Onlookers could do nothing but gape in horror, and if that wasn't terrible enough, the molten iron wasn't deep enough to engulf his entire body all in one go. Workers fished what was left of him, including his head and upper torso, out with the long poles, his bowels dropping out and splashing into the red-hot molten iron as they did. As terrible as conditions were, there wasn't much else around, and as the years went on, demand for iron skyrocketed. The hungry, growing country began to rely on the tons of iron rolling out of Birmingham every day. Thousands of workers every year filed through those furnaces, and most of them were African American, being many in the area and the most willing to work for lesser pay. Only a few years later, in 1890, James Withers Sloss died comfortably in his home, a wealthy man. His obituary stressed that his far-seeing discernment, indomitable energy, and modern ideas were what turned a muddy town full of shacks and shanties into a bustling industrial metropolis. Now, if you've heard anything at all of Sloss Furnace, you may have heard of one James SLAG Wormwood. The man around this time gained a notorious status as a night foreman in charge of the graveyard shift at one of Sloss's furnaces. Upper management were often very impressed by the amount of iron produced during his shifts, but it didn't happen because he had an impeccable work ethic. Rather, it was because he was a slave driver who continually barked orders at his employees, forced them to take unnecessary risks, and physically assaulted those who tried to take breaks. Slag found a sadistic pleasure in abusing those who worked under him. Although upper management loved him, he was universally hated among the workers. It was said that 47 people died under his watch, but eventually he got what was coming to him. One night, it was required of him to inspect some machinery atop one of the highest blast furnaces which he had never set foot on prior to that night. It was reported that gas fumes seeping through the walls caused Slag to become disoriented on the catwalk, where he tumbled over the railing and, like Jowers, fell screaming into a vat of molten iron. Although horrific, those who worked there celebrated his demise, and rumors began to spread that his accident was anything but an accident. It was thought that a few night employees lured him to the top of the furnace and, taking him by surprise, forced him over the edge and into the iron below. No one, however, was ever brought to trial. Although this is a story that very well could have much in the way of truth, there actually is no record of this James Slag Wormwood. Historians suggest that it is merely a legend handed down throughout the years that could very well incorporate the general feel and other elements of truth, but largely they claim that Slag is merely a fictitious character made up to embody and illustrate the horrors of Sloss Furnace. But the truth is sometimes more terrible than fiction. Take, for instance, an accident that occurred just prior to the turn of the century. In 1897, Joseph Webb, now an artist for the railroad company, would leave a local bar one night saying he was heading home. He left with a brand new pair of shoes he had recently purchased for his wife. Webb would never make it home. He was discovered the next morning, boiled to death, in one of Sloss Furnace's large water tanks. The New York Times reported that the body was cooked and the flesh fell off in chunks as it was drawn from the vat, a pair of women's shoes floating next to him. It couldn't be confirmed by authorities, but the thought was that on top of all of the other terrible things going on in the area, that a murderer was on the loose in Birmingham and had killed Webb for some unknown reason. It's said that Webb's wife, shortly thereafter, grief-stricken, killed herself. A few years prior, a new blast stove was being erected. 8 men standing on the scaffolding carefully maneuvered the stove into place when all of a sudden the scaffolding broke into pieces, unable to withstand the weight. All 8 plummeted nearly 60 feet to the hard steel floor. John Statton and John Ritchie both died instantly. 5 others were permanently injured, later dying from those injuries. Incredibly, however, Jerry Moore walked away nearly unscathed. But the event haunted him for the remainder of his life. And actually, hauntings were starting to become a problem, as you can imagine. If the work conditions weren't hellish enough, now employees of Sloss Furnace had to deal with ever-increasing reports of strange, shadowy figures, blurry-faced apparitions, and even demonic-like entities who roamed the complex day and night. In 1899, Sloss Furnace reorganized into Sloss Sheffield Steel and Iron, expanding even further. Building with rapid growth, the company would acquire 120,000 new acres of land, rich with coal and iron. Dozens more furnaces would dot the land, and more people every year pouring into Birmingham would feed the furnace's need for workers. And given new management, the Sloss Sheffield Company began working with local law enforcement who would provide forced convict labor. The catch was, these convicts were mostly all black men. It wasn't a secret that many of them were wrongly convicted with the purpose of feeding the company's need for cheap and expendable labor. True justice was still far and away for freed slaves. Dr. W. David Lewis, in his book Sloss Furnace and the Rise of the Birmingham District, wrote, "Convict labor, mostly black, was an important weapon in the district's economic warfare with northern manufacturing." And then SlossFurnace.com goes on to say that slavery had not died, but merely been transformed. A manufacturing machine in 1902 ruptured, drenching an entire room of workers in scalding hot steam. The blast engulfed their bodies with a blistering and suffocating wave. 2 of them ran from the room screaming out in agony, their skin bubbling up off of their flesh before dropping to the ground, dead. Witnesses said that they thought the 2 were killed instantly and only had the wherewithal to run away because they hadn't realized it yet. Around this time, one of the most horrific accidents took place. Worse than the rest, if you can imagine it. Throughout the factories, there were giant, industrial-sized flywheels that rotated quickly, powering the large boilers. At this time, there were no safety measures or railings to prevent people from approaching the wheels, and a worker eating his lunch too close to one of those wheels was snagged up and dragged through the gears. Chunks of him were being torn off with every round the gear made. Onlookers reported that every time the wheel made a full rotation, less of the man was still intact. And because you couldn't turn these wheels off in a timely manner, by the time it did stop, there was nothing left of him. It was just a chunky pool of human remains that painted the entire surrounding area red. In 1905, Sloss Furnace, the one where Jowers had died and been partially incinerated, was torn down. Shortly after that, a worker from Sloss Furnace who had known Jowers those years earlier was shocked to see Jowers report to work at Sloss Furnace. He did a double take and Jowers had vanished. Apparently, Jowers' promise in life to his wife that as long as a furnace stood in the valley, he would be there, continued in his heart even after his death. Sloss was torn down and his spirit apparently found new employment at Sloss, where he has reportedly been working ever since. As the years went on, more would suffer and die as demand for iron continued to increase year after year. The American Industrial Revolution, being driven by the sheer will of those who worked and sacrificed in abysmal conditions, powered America through 2 world wars and many years of explosive commercial growth. The furnace changed hands multiple times, and eventually government mandates would give increasing rights to workers, and safety regulations would inevitably contribute to better working conditions. Although conditions slowly got better, it was as if some cosmic scale tipped in the favor of those who had already suffered and died there. Reports of the dead coming back to terrorize the living skyrocketed. In 1926, a night watchman claimed that he was shoved from behind, which caused him to sustain injuries while falling down a flight of stairs. To his horror, a gravelly, disembodied voice shouted at him to
"Get back to work."
It echoed in his mind and throughout the darkness pervading the facility. The night watchman, astonished, looked up, and there was no one there. One day in 1947, 3 supervisors all simultaneously failed to show up to work. After an extensive search of the premises, all 3 were found unconscious and locked in a boiler room. None of them could explain what had happened to them exactly, although they eventually, one by one, reported to have been approached at some point in the night by a man with burned skin who angrily shouted at them to
push some steel.
In 1971, Samuel Blumenthal, another night watchman, was rushed to the hospital after an incident he could hardly speak of. After doctors found multiple burns all over his body, Blumenthal spoke up and cautiously reported that he was approached that night by a half-man, half-demon who physically assaulted him. He said that he came face to face that night with pure evil. Michael Scogins, a security guard, relates a more recent incident, which is documented by Zach Baggins from Ghost Adventures. He claims that one night while making his rounds, he saw a dark, shadowy figure about 30 feet away in an area where there wasn't supposed to be anyone. In the blink of an eye, and horrifyingly as Scogins was about to go investigate, the figure appeared right in front of him, reaching into his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs, and psychically imprinting into his mind to
get out.
What I've shared with you are only a few of the hundreds and probably thousands of reports of strange, ghostly, and demonic phenomena occurring in and around Sloss Furnace. An honest look at the sheer abundance of activity going on here forces even the most ardent skeptic to question their understanding of the world. And to the believers, it forces us to wonder whether James SLAG Wormwood is really merely a fictitious character as historians claim. Many think he was real, and that he continues his sadistic rule over Sloss Furnace to this day. Sloss Furnace would eventually shut down and be transformed into a museum. It's now a historic site where many gather to reflect on all that took place there. And during the Halloween months, it's turned into a haunted house attraction, donning the name Fright Furnace. Parts of the machinery that still remain are some of the oldest blowing engines still around. Though many suffered in these furnaces, they are an important part of the museum's collection because despite many of the atrocities that took place at Sloss, they helped power the American Industrial Revolution and ultimately built the world that you and I live in and benefit from to this day. Although a poignant comment made by one Don Monroe sticks out in my mind and heart. He wrote, "The reality of Sloss must be remembered as evil in confession and repentance. To know that the overlords of this demonic lair made millions and are praised as captains of industry that made America wealthy and powerful is almost too much to bear." If you find yourself wondering whether or not ghosts are real, try as I might, I can't really give you a satisfactory answer to that complicated question. But what I can tell you without any doubt is that evil does exist, and Sloss aptly illustrates this fact. But that also means that there is good in the world as well. And even though many of us will never experience the horrors outlined in this episode, you and I walk the line between good and evil every day, in subtle, often unpronounced ways. And in this time of exceptional confusion, it's worth really digging deep to examine what it is that you actually believe and why. Potentially in the process confronting demons hiding out in the unattended recesses of our souls. And though often unsightly, it's better to be uncomfortable and know that they are there than to pretend that they never existed at all.